The near future is European, whether you like it or not, and it's gonna be a European non-hegemony. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert D. Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, in a rather free form, I wish to talk about the near future. By near, I mean like 20 to 50 years, maybe, something like that. And like what's going on in the world in general, okay? But before I do that, I wish to return like a long time before, into 16th century roughly, which is what I would call like a border of history. So 16th century is roughly the time when something begins to be seen. Now, of course, if you've studied history in school, you might say, well, what the hell are you talking about? We know history really, really well, like for like almost 5,000 years BC or AD or whatever you call it, right? Well, I don't think so. Long story short, so I think that basically the history before 16th century, and you've heard this thought many times before, right? Before 16th century, it's like a fairy tale, right? Around 16th century is where things begin to be seen, and after that, they are seen more and more clearer, right? So yeah, and basically all of this time span falls onto the history of national states, right? Or, you know, countries or whatever. Even though centralized states, strictly speaking, appeared after the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in the middle of the 17th century. But anyway, we're kind of used to perceive history as the history of states or countries, all right? Or political actors of that sort. So we even like pretend that, let's say, feudal states were also countries, even though they were not. Like, we pretend as if they were, like, you know, national states, even though, again, they're absolutely not, etc., etc. So, yeah, there is a certain aberration of this sort in the perception of history in our culture. So, why am I talking about all of this? Is because, well, now, in the previous, in the modern era, what we have is actually the decline of the national state and basically the disappearance thereof, right? Okay, a brief digression. So, I've heard a very interesting thought that, there have been, pretty solid, like centralization mechanisms in human history in these, observable 500 years of it. At least, or like more like 400 years actually. So first and they correspond to the, let's say, mechanisms of information transfer. So we've had the invention of the book printing in the 16th century. Well, you would say, it was 15th century actually. Well, probably not. It was probably 16th century or even, well, something like that. So what happened then is appearance of religion. Again, see my video on the origin of religion and gods. So we have the centralized, organized, monotheistic religion appearing because of the appearance of book printing. That's one way of centralization, right? Of ideological homogenization of society and preparing them to be, preparing the people to become a part of the centralized state. That's one thing, and that's 16th century, right? In the 17th century, it peaked. So like Christianity peaked in like 17th century, and in 18th century it became like a meme, basically a joke, right? Then we have nationalism, the appearance of which corresponds to the appearance of print, like not just the printing press, but like the regular periodic like journals and like newspapers, right? So nationalism appeared in 17th century, then in 18th century it peaked. Actually, never mind, it appeared in 18th century, in 19th century it peaked, and in 20th century it became a joke, right? So in 20th century only like backwater third world countries became nationalistic, like, like African countries, Asian countries like Ukraine or Belarus, for example, right? Yeah. And what else? And after that we've had like social democracy, right? So we've had Christianity, roughly speaking, monotheistic religion, then nationalism as the main tools of centralization. Then we had the Church of Social Democracy, right? Roughly speaking, Marxism, like the Fabian Society, the Saint-Simonists, Marxists, feminists, I don't know, you name it, the LGBTQ, I don't know, Black Lives Matter, all of this thing. Actually, Black Lives Matter is already past this thing. It's already when it became a joke, right? So it appeared in like 1870s, roughly, you know, maybe 40s, if you are like stretching it very far, when, you know, the Communist Manifesto appeared. So then it peaked at the first half of the 20th century, and then in the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of third century, right? Not century, actually 21st century, yeah. So right now, basically, it became a joke, right? So what did it correspond to? It was telegraph, right? Then radio, then television. And now we have the internet. And now something else is about to happen, or already is happening, right? But roughly speaking, some new way of centralization should appear, or at least it appears so, no pun intended. But national states are like no longer functional, it appears, okay? Of course, there have been many other mechanisms of governance, let's say, besides national states, but that's a whole other story. So, yeah. So what's going to happen? So, yeah, returning to the issue of the national state. So, in this context, what is convenient is using this sort of approach where you have like a state which is like the most powerful state on the planet, and like the second most powerful state on the planet, and so to perceive history as the interplay between these two, right? Or maybe more than two, like if we have like the most powerful and a couple of less powerful, right? So it becomes really easy to perceive historical events and whatever, to dramatize them, to eventify them. See my video, Events versus Processes. So to basically depict them in some way, to explain them in some way, to retell them in some way, if you wish, right? So it's a very convenient vehicle, and but it also corresponds to states, right? To some centralized organizations of this sort, to countries, roughly speaking. So it's also kind of not very usable before, let's say, 16th century, 17th century, when there were no national states, no countries at all, right? But still, you can like vaguely use it and say like the first hegemon was Spain, right? So it's right at the very edge of the visibility of history, like 16th century. Spain is still a hegemon. France is like a sub-hegemon, the second biggest power in the world. But then already in like 17th century, Spain gets, you know, they got their ass kicked by France and the newly found Britain, so to speak. So now it's all about France as the strongest country, and the Britain as the second strongest country, right? And then they struggle, and in 19th century, finally, Britain becomes the first, the most strongest country, and the second becomes, well, arguably France, but also Russia, partly Germany, right? Something like that. Yeah. And in 20th century, basically the whole history of 20th century is Britain slowly losing its power to the rising America, right? The United States. So after the World War I, Britain was still a hegemon, but Russia was destroyed after the British had inspired the inspired not only British. Firstly, there were Germans as well. Participating in the revolution, right? The demolition of the Russian monarchy and the Russian culture, you might claim, with the communist revolution. So, yeah, by the way, all the communist revolutions are sponsored by British. Just FYI. And also, an interesting thing, all the Hungarians that you ever see are also British agents. So George Soros, you get the idea, right? Not only, I mean, there have been plenty of people, it's especially in Soviet history, with like very weird Hungarian people, right? So yeah, we get the idea. Hungarian people, yeah, sure. So yeah, what was I talking about? Yeah, so the beginning of 20th century, basically after World War I, Britain is still, you know, the first power in the world. The second is America, and after the World War II, it's the reverse, right? So the United States is now the strongest power, and Britain is now the second strongest power. What Britain does is creates problems for America everywhere in the world, for not to allow it to become even stronger, right? So Britain has the USSR as their colony. They have all of the other colonies, you know, like India, Australia, and Canada, and whatever, and like tons of naval bases all over the world, and like Arabia, etc., etc. And then what happens is British create European Union, right? They're trying to raise this new animal to help them fight against the Americans. And whenever Americans try to prevent the European integration, like the British take their, you know, pet, their doggy, the USSR, to create problems for the United States. And another thing that British try to seize is China, obviously. Basically, the World War II is the war for China, the last big unclaimed colonial piece on the face of this planet. So, yeah. So whenever Americans try to get into China, problems appear, right? Firstly, the Communist Revolution in the China itself. Then you have the Korean War, like the Americans tried to invade China through Korea. You have North Korea appearing, you know, the British Korea. Then they try to invade it through Vietnam. You have, you know, all the troubles with Vietnam, etc., etc. So basically, Americans failed in invasion of China and like any sort of reclaiming thereof. So, and after the handover of Hong Kong, China is basically controlled by Britain now, alright? So yeah, but the European Union is on the rise, and this is gonna be the story of the next, I don't know, 30 years roughly, at least 50, maybe 100, maybe even 500, I don't know. We'll see. Like, the thing is, like, you see that these new actors are no longer national states. They can even almost be like, it's very hard to identify what's going on, right? It's very hard to eventify the actual processes that are taking place right now. Like, it's very hard to construct an actor that would actually enact like some thing that would take place. It's actually like a very strong, very complicated interplay of all kinds of things, right? So it's kind of hard, yeah. But basically what I'm saying is that there is a European Union as the newly born power, which is already kind of matching the British Empire in many respects. I mean, economically, it's already surpassing, right? Intellectually, like in terms of like intelligence services, probably still not, right? So all the troubles with like blowing up of gas pipes, you know, in the Baltic Sea or wherever that happened, like the Nord Stream explosion, has shown that the European intelligence services are kind of suck, right? So when the never mind. So yeah, and now they're trying to acquire an army with the help of the war between the, you know, the, how would you call it? The tribe chieftains, Zelensky and Putin. The colonial leaders in Brussels and London are trying to procure an army, a unified European army, in order to basically kick NATO out of Europe, right? So this is the goal of the Russia-Ukrainian war, which I talked about in my video, Ukraine Special. Yeah, so when the European Union will get an army, maybe Britain would like sigh with a relief and say, okay, there's finally a power in the world able to compete against Americans. So now we can, like, you know, retire finally. You know, the British Empire would finally collapse. See the discussion of this issue in my video about the decline of the Western civilization. Is Western world coming to an end? Yeah. So what's going to happen to Britain itself? It's probably going to dissolve into the European Union by parts, you know, like Euro regions. But the empire wouldn't disappear again. It would transform probably one more time. Like, most likely would be basically, like, London would become like almost like, you know, Geneva in Switzerland. It would become like a city that belongs to the world rather than to Britain, you know, something else, something like that. And like, maybe Britain tries to sort of restructure itself in order to become basically the seat of the world's government, something like that. I assume. I mean, British are smart in this sense, right? They are very, very predatory and clever in this sense. So maybe they're like looking at things like many decades ahead. So Brexit was part of that thing. Like, they're saying, okay, we are kind of a neutral country from now on. Like, we see what's going on. We want to, like, moderate the process rather than being a part of it, right? Something to that effect. So perhaps. Other thing that's certainly going to happen is increase in the power of India, right? India has always been the heart of the British Empire. So right now, it's most likely, we're going to see a severe increase in economic, and political and perhaps military and whatever other ties of Britain with India. Yeah, something like that. Like, maybe actually, you know, like, India will become like the center of the British Empire. And again, London would become like the, you know, the city of the world, something like that. I don't know. But that's not too wild of a guess, I would say, right? Other than that, like, what's going to happen to Russia? Well, it's going to be, again, separated into parts, right? So the self-destructory policy that Russia enacts right now, well, firstly, again, as I've said, it's needed to create a European army. Secondly, it's needed to, well, you know, in December, it's going to be 100 years since the creation of the USSR. And yeah, like, it's probably time to, you know, let it rest. So Russia is the largest remnant of the USSR, Russian Federation, I mean, not Russia as like the cultural entity. But this weird animal, anti-Russian actually creation of Russian Federation needs to be demolished, finally. And probably going to be like in the span of the next 10 years or about so. Perhaps much sooner. Actually, 2024 seems to be a very important date in this respect. If not this, then 2030, it's like probably the last cutoff. So yeah, so the westernmost part of Russia would be Euro-integrated, eventually, right? Then again, the Arabic world would become a part of the European Union at some point. Like, it would become a buffer between the European Union and the sub-Saharan Africa. And the Middle East would become a buffer between the European Union and India and China, let's say, or other British colonies in Asia. All right. Yeah, so something like that. So long story short, near future is European. And it's going to be marked by the European non-hegemony and the free, democratic, liberal commonwealth of everyone else. All right. What do I mean by non-hegemony? Well, I've already mentioned that the states, like in this simple scheme, you have a hegemon state and like a sub-hegemon or a few of them, right? And sort of this dynamic between them basically determines what's going on in the world at this particular era. But right now we have like post-state world, right? And after the American hegemony, I mean, look at all of the let's say outcry all over the world of, you know, anti-globalists, anti-Americanists, etc., etc. So Europe would dominate. I mean, when Europe would finally surpass the United States, which would happen again pretty soon, Again, America was completely sabotaged by the intellectual influence from both Britain and the European Union, by philosophy essentially, right, and by Marxism as well. So first they've infiltrated the academia and then like the creative people, and so at the end basically the whole American society collapsed, and again things like Black Lives Matter appeared, which is again already a joke, you know, in the smart people's world. Like it's an offshoot of this social democracy world, which is already coming to an end. But in America, people somehow take it seriously, right? So yeah, so Europeans are too smart to become the hegemons, because they understand that the hegemon is recognizable, and, you know, as I've said in my video about names, I don't remember how I called it, which is kind of ironic, right? But anyway, so in this video I talked about how, like, if you have a name, or a face, if you wish, in this case, like you can be attacked, right? If you don't have a name, you are unrecognizable, right? I probably give this Sun Tzu quote in this video, like, if I determine the enemy's disposition of forces while I have no perceptible form, I can concentrate my forces while the enemy is fragmented. The pinnacle of military deployment approaches the formless, for if it is formless, then even the deepest spy cannot discern it, nor the wise make plans against it, right? So if you're not a hegemon, if you don't have a face, if you are unrecognizable as such, as a hegemon, you won't be attacked, you won't be surpassed by anything, right? You would just rule, and that's it, all right? Of course, you would need other methods to do that, but Europeans, I mean, they have a few centuries of intellectual history. I think they can handle that. Again, the older brother Britain might help them out. Why not? Yeah, so the European hegemony would be an emphasizingly non-hegemonical, right? It's actually the countering the hegemony is how Europeans would acquire their hegemony. Countering the current American hegemony, right? Is how the Europeans would acquire their own hegemony. That is, put the America down a little bit. Again, through all these LGBTQ minority studies, etc., through the demolition of American society, through turning them into Brazil, essentially, etc., and yeah. And Europeans would say, well, guys, like Americans, I mean, you've made quite a bit of a ruckus in 20th and 21st centuries all over the world. Like, you have to repent, you know. You have to maybe pay some reparations for that, you know. So, yeah. We Europeans are, you know, we're inclusive. We are all for this kind of stuff already, like a long time ago. It's you guys, you know. You guys need to repent, Americans. We're not the hegemons. No, we're not. That's what the European hegemony would look like, all right? Yeah. So you will see more and more reports, for example, how Europe stagnates, how everyone dies, like whatever, you know. It's actually very funny to see all these reports where Europeans tell how weak, how everything is so bad in Europe, right? Yeah, but it's also Sun Tzu, obviously, right? Like, when you are strong, pretend to be weak. You know, it's this Palpatine, like, oh, I'm just a poor old man, Anakin, save me, you know. And this is the European hegemony for you. Yeah. All right. So yeah, conclusion is that near future is European, whether you like it or not. And it's gonna be a European non-hegemony. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.